This is Boom and Bust in Modern America, Objective 3, Part 2 of our discussion about the contemporary, or in other words, modern economy from the 1970s to the present day. Now, we already took a look at the stagnant, non-moving, non-spending really economy of the 1970s, and in Part 2 we want to take a look at how we started to get out of that, reach the 90s tech boom, and get to the current economy that we have today. Now, the policies of the 1980s eventually start with this guy, Ronald Reagan, the president from 1981 to 1989, and the Reaganomics economic policies that he had. But to understand what Reaganomics was, we have to go back and take a look at our old friend, the spending cycle. Now, you should remember, I hope, that spending is what drives the economy. Whether the people do that by having extra money in their pockets from low taxes, or the government does it by raising taxes and doing the spending themselves, spending's got to happen to drive an economy. When people are spending on goods and services, the demand for those goods and services is obviously up. I mean, people are spending a lot of money on them. When producers see that, they'll increase their supply, and frankly their prices, which is good for them. I mean, that's the law of supply. More people want it, the more I'll put on the shelves and the more I'll charge for them to buy it. And when you have to supply that much more, you're going to put people to work and give them wages, putting money in their pockets, and they're going to go out and spend on a lot of products as well. Traditionally, this is how the economy has always worked, and Reagan's approach was a little bit different because he just said, go ahead and create a surplus. Just go ahead and put people to work and have them supply more of what we already have that nobody is buying. Frankly, a lot of people were pretty skeptical that this could work. If the first part of your plan is to just simply overproduce and create a surplus, you're basically committing to the idea that you're going to have product sitting in parking lots and laying around in factories and laying off workers. Why hire more people to produce more things when you're already overproducing and not able to sell it as it is? George Bush, who was running against Ronald Reagan for the Republican nomination for president in 1980, called it voodoo economics. After Reagan got the nomination and made Bush his vice president, Bush seemed to like voodoo economics just fine. But the thing is that Reagan said, basically, we're going to overfill the bucket. Take a bucket, put a hose in it, fill it to the top with water, and leave the hose running, let it spill over the sides. I'll provide you with the sponge to soak it up and eventually start working on what's in the bucket. The way he decided to do that was with money. I'll put more money in your pockets. And that meant decreases in individual tax rates, reduced federal estate taxes, and tax-free savings plans for small investors. Basically, with these extreme tax cuts, he was freeing up a ton of money for spending on products and also money to invest in new businesses and start new businesses in America. The idea being that if everybody starts new businesses, that boom will trickle down to the workers. If a new business is getting started, more jobs will be produced that way. In other words, I'm going to cut your taxes, put more money in your pocket, just keep people working, and we'll spend and soak up the surplus of goods and products that we have. And so, starting in 1981 and lasting over a period of 3 years, substantial tax reductions took place to kick off the Reaganomics era. And the result, which was expected, was an absolutely brutal recession from 1981 to 1983. The surplus had the expected effects from 1981 to 83 as unemployment went up 11%. Remember, when you've already got too much, you don't need to hire people to make more. In fact, you're laying them off. And in the first 2 years of Reaganomics, violent crime went up 33% in the inner cities. Murders, robberies, rapes, drug sales, things like that. When you have tax cuts that massive, it's going to cut out a lot of social programs too. And when the things that people had relied on before are gone, they're going to turn to other activities. Knowing that, it would probably be pretty easy to view Reaganomics as a colossal failure, except that in 1983, the economy started winning See what I did there? Anyway, the bottom line is that people had extra money in their pockets and they were buying up the surplus and they were starting to invest in businesses at a pretty rapid rate. Some people were referring to the 80s as the roaring 80s, although I think that's taken it a little bit too far. So things were going really well. However, people still were pointing out that the rich-poor gap had gotten wider. And as for the middle class, they were starting to elevate to a higher tax bracket. As demonstrated in one of the most famous symbols of 1980s culture, the young urban professional, the Yup, also known as the Yuppie. Now I want you to take a good look at this slide and pause it and memorize it a little bit before you move on, because you'll find that if you were willing to follow the Yuppie handbook, you too could be a real-life Yuppie. I mean, seriously, go back to the previous slide and look at the cover of the Yuppie handbook, and then look at this picture. It's almost the exact same thing. Now, the Great American Yuppie is a pretty classic case study. These were baby boomers, people born in the post-World War II baby boom of like 1946 to 1960, which would make them in their late teens, early 20s during the protest era of the 1960s, and most likely some of them were probably part of the hippie movement. As they got a little older into young adulthood, they lived through the stagflation of the 1970s, and they entered into the Reagan era still plenty young, probably in their early 30s. The stereotypical American Yuppie was someone who was young and suddenly very wealthy, oftentimes without ever even getting a college degree to make that happen. It was just part of the roaring 80s economic boom, as a lot of them got jobs as stock traders or stockbrokers, things like that. The stereotypical Yuppie would wear a Rolex, drive a fancy car, often a BMW, and typically carry around this thing, the earliest cell phone that I know of, the classic 80s brick cell phone. I mean, take a look at this thing. You'd need a briefcase just for that to haul that around. Much bigger than the phones we carry around today, obviously. It became such a prevalent part of American culture that by 1983-84, it started to be known as the year of the Yuppie, as some of the people who had protested big business capitalist policies in the 1960s were now actually starting to benefit from them. But in truth, the Yuppie of the 1980s was a little bit overblown as a concept. Out of the entire nation of people, you're talking about over 300 million, only about 1.5 million people demographically would really be considered a Yuppie. It became more of a stereotype than anything else. But it was fun. Another major cultural symbol of the Reaganomics era was the corporate raider. Now, a raider, of course, is like a pirate. They're going to take your ship, they're going to take everything on it, they'll possibly kill you in the process, and maybe even destroy your ship in the end. Well, corporate raiders were a new type of investor in the 1980s who would execute a hostile takeover of a company. Basically, that meant sweeping in as a stranger to companies that had been owned by families, in some cases for 50 years or more, and buying up all the majority shares of the stocks as fast as you possibly could, showing up at the board meeting with nobody knowing who you were, saying, "I'm the majority shareholder," taking the company and then breaking it up into pieces and selling those pieces off, regardless of who got hurt or what jobs got lost along the way. The bottom line is that it was a pretty popular concept made famous by Cornelius Vanderbilt that we hadn't seen in a while, and in the prosperity and the spending and investing period of the 1980s, the corporate raider becomes a major symbol. But there's a third component to Reaganomics that we haven't even discussed yet, and that's the massive military buildup. $2 trillion was spent on the military from 1981 to 1989. Which was just fine with this guy. Go ahead and take it to the limit because there's always going to be another plane. Sorry, I had to include this slide. Top Gun's one of my favorite movies. Anywho, the idea was that we had to catch up to the Soviet Union in the arms race. There were a lot of mitigating factors that were indicating that maybe we were starting to fall behind, particularly with missile technology. And so Reagan took care of that to the tune of $2 trillion and made sure we had pretty much everything we needed. The problem is that the military spending was starting to become somewhat controversial. Remember that Reagan is a conservative Republican president, and typically that's going to mean lower taxes, more spending money, and yeah, a strong national defense program. But in being a conservative president, you typically don't get involved in deficit spending. That's something that the conservative Republicans usually blame the Democrats for. The idea that they're going to, raise taxes, borrow money from your own people and other countries, and spend that all on social programs, putting yourself into a big debt. Well, Reagan obviously wasn't doing that, but by cutting taxes so low, he had to borrow even more to pay for the military program and put us even into a bigger deficit than we probably had ever really known. By the end of Reaganomics, we figured that our average deficit was about $200 billion per year. Reaganomics was starting to work, there was no question about it, but now the big question was going to be, were future generations going to be stuck with the military deficit bill? By the time we got to the late 1980s, enough prosperity had built up and happened that it opened the door for a 1990s technology boom. And that tech boom was the third most prosperous decade of the 20th century, and actually began with an invention from the 1970s, the personal computer. Here's an example of the old IBM model that I would have learned on back in junior high. The thing that really led to the breakthrough of the personal computer was the Apple Macintosh in 1984. The Apple had all the features you could ever ask for, and frankly a lot of the features that we still use today. It was an immediate success and promoted a series of jobs in the tech industry. The other part of that technology boom was the Internet. Between the Microsoft Corporation and the Internet, the tech boom that happened in the 90s had really created a huge amount of jobs through a huge amount of supply of computer goods, technology goods that had been in great demand. That's just how the spending cycle basically works. And as a result, the world was becoming much smaller, kind of a global village, as we all could communicate with each other much, much better. When you really look at the technological advances of the last century, we've accomplished more in the last 100 years than we did in the previous 5,000 years combined, realistically. When you take a look at things like the Silicon Revolution, which starts off with a computer chip the size of your thumbnail that has roughly, 10 transistors per chip by 1977, and had almost 1 million transistors per chip by the year 2000. And it's only continuing to grow. More transistors on the silicon chip means even faster computers. Or, if you take a look at the fiber optics revolution that took place, a fiber optic cable consists of a strand of glass the diameter of a human hair illuminated by a laser. By 1996, a 90-kilometer network could operate at a speed of 1 trillion bits per second. That translates to relaying every word ever published in the New York Times in 1/3 of a second. By 2000, we were laying down 4,000 miles of fiber optic cable per day, using it for our phone, our TV, our internet, and our email. The dot-com boom expanded and made global markets possible, information and innovation easier, and provided even more stock opportunities, not to mention all the jobs that it provided. There are some negatives, though, most notably creating a society where we spend way too much time in front of our screen instead of communicating with the people around us, and wiping out traditional jobs like postal carriers, travel agents, store clerks, bank tellers, stockbrokers, and frankly the outsourcing of a lot of jobs. But that wasn't really the biggest reason for the recession of 2008. The biggest reason would be bad mortgages, reckless loans being given out by banks to people who couldn't afford them. By the time people started to figure that out, it was almost too late, as foreclosures were happening across the board, stock markets were going down. People were discovering that they had lost millions on the stock market, in some cases billions. People were taking to the streets to see the big mortgage lenders punished. The government started to get involved and try to institute new policies, which included, in some cases, taking over reckless businesses. And some indications are that we're starting to come out of it now, although that remains to be seen. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much for listening.